Well, sorry for the delay. James is up, and we are hopefully recording this time.
Yeah, hopefully it works. We'll see. All right. So quick show of hands. How many of y'all have ever written a gem to wrap an API? All right. We've got 4 or 5 of us in here. All right. Well, hopefully this will be educational. When I first started thinking about how to do this talk, I was originally thinking I was going to grab an API and do some live coding and actually write a gem for it or for this presentation. And then I decided that'd be a horrible idea. And so instead, we're going to look at a few examples, progressively more complex examples of how you can write gems to wrap APIs, but also want to talk a little bit about some of the things you need to think about before you go down this path, before you go down the path of actually writing your own gem to wrap an API. So introductions have already been done, but there's my glamour shot. A little bit more about me, and you can find me online as Plain Programmer pretty much anywhere. So that's great. And also, anybody recognize the logo on the polo shirt? Starfleet. There you go. Non-Federation of Planets. Excellent. So I feel great having this photo while wearing my Rebel Scum t-shirt. So I'm a fan of both. Both Trek and Star Wars. So why would you want to write a gem to wrap an API? This is the first question that you must answer. If you don't have a good answer for this, you just need to stop and do something else. Now, a good answer to this should be technically sound and concise. If it's not those two things, you're probably doing something wrong. A couple good answers to this question. A gem for this API does not already exist. It's concise and it has a good technical foundation. Or there is a gem for this API, but it's outdated and or broken. Another good reason you might want to consider writing a wrapping API or a wrapping gem for an API. Although, since we're open source folks, hopefully, you should probably try to resurrect the dead project or contribute to it to make it actually work if you can. A bad answer to this question would be, well, I submitted a pull request to change all the methods in this API gem to bacon ipsum, and it got rejected, so I'm going to start my own thing. That's a bad reason. One, because it's way too long and it's way too personal. You should have a technical foundation for why you're doing this, not just a personal, connection of having been scorned as a developer. So this is the first thing you need to deal with is why are you doing this? What is the technical reason? What problem are you trying to solve? Just like any other programming task, when you're writing a gem for anything, and especially for writing an API, have a clear reason for doing it. It'll make the development be a lot better for you. Now, the first step you need to go through is understanding the API. You need to know what it is you're coding against. What is this API? What does it do? What does it provide? What are all the behaviors that it's exposing to me? And the best place to start is with the manual, with the documentation. Figure out what is already available to you. Hopefully you have documentation for the API you're wanting to code against. Not always. Depending on the line of work you're in, sometimes not even often. But if you've got documentation, read it. If you don't have documentation, get really friendly with curl or IRB and just poke at the thing. That's a great way to figure things out. But understand the API. Figure out what's available to you, what's accessible to you. You don't have to be a complete expert in it, but you need to have at least a grasp of what is going on, what's available to you. Second, you need to think about a general strategy. You need to think about what are your technical restrictions, what are the technical requirements for talking to this API. As an example, last company I worked for, Nudge, we had a product called Microsoft Dynamics CRM. It exposes a REST API using the OData specification, but it requires NTLM to be able to talk to it. And so that little technical detail that you could only talk to this thing using NTLM authentication meant that I could not use NetHTTP. I could not use pretty much anything in the Ruby world except for curb, because it was the only thing that sat directly on top of libcurl and would let me pass it just whatever options libcurl would accept. And so having those side of technical insights into the API you're working with, really, really important, because most APIs will have little weird gotchas whether it's in this format of what's coming back to you, the format of what you need to send, or just the general how you need to talk to it. And so you need to do your research and figure out what those details are and come up with a strategy for how to deal with them. Once you know those things, you can start picking gems, various things that you can rely on. You can figure out how you need to do configuration, whether you just need to store a couple of pieces of user credential information, or whether you need to have a full-blown configuration object to store all the various details about what you need to have to talk to the thing. So you need to have a good understanding of what you're doing. Next, you want to delve into the purpose of the API and your gem. Why are you building this? What itch are you scratching? And is it an itch you will have when you no longer work for your current employer? If you're building a gem as an employee, either your company needs to commit to maintaining that thing, or you need to commit to maintaining that thing. Because nothing's worse than going on Ruby gems, finding something that's like, oh, this might work, and oh crap, it's been abandoned for 3 years. That's a horrible thing, and it happens all the time. Don't be that guy if you can avoid it. So delve into the purpose of the API. Why are you doing it? What's available to you? What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to solve? What's your gem going to contribute that something else out there doesn't already? And so there's some soul searching that needs to be done in your trying to understand the API that you're coding against, and then also the gem that you're going to write. Now, after that, you need to start making choices. Once you have a good understanding of the API, you can start making choices. What's important and what can wait? Too often when you start trying to write a gem to wrap an API or anything, you try to bite off the whole thing at once. But not everything is equally important. Figure out what's the most important to you, especially if you're building this as an employee or building this for a project that you're doing. What are the aspects of the API that you actually care about, and deal with those first. Tackle the things that actually matter to you, and then figure out what can wait and what you need to come back to. Then, how do you want to handle configuration? This is after if you've got a good understanding, do I only need to have a user ID and an access key, or do I need to have a bunch of other information? Once you know that, figure out how you're going to handle it. Are you going to force people who use your gem to store all of that in a YAML file, and you're going to have to load that via a rail tie? Are you going to let them just shove that information in via a hash? How are you going to handle configuration? And do you need to be able to keep track of multiple configurations at once? Is your gem going to actually be able to be pointed at different API endpoints? And that normally comes if you're doing like a protocol wrapper, something like OData, JSON API, where you may have a more generic solution that you're developing to be able to talk to multiple providers that all have the same API. Again, stuff that you need to start figuring out. And of course, this is obvious advice, but don't make things too complicated from the get-go. Try to be as concrete as you can be from the beginning. And that's, just a bit of advice that I'm pretty sure that most people who have done this would probably share is don't get ahead of yourself. Solve the problem in front of you first. Now, what things would you change about the API? How many of you have ever dealt with an API that was utter garbage? All right. Don't be afraid to fix it. Now, you can't change the API's code. You can't change what they're providing for you. But in your gem, don't be afraid to make it easier for anybody else who may come along after you. Don't be afraid to figure out, oh, these two resources are actually related to each other. I kind of see the relationship in the API, but it's not really obvious. I'm going to, in my gem, make them behave in some kind of a unit sort of way. So again, think about what you would change about the API, and don't be afraid to do that. Now, sometimes you should just, and actually you probably always start by simply reflecting the API as literally as possible in your code. Have a one-to-one correspondence between what you're doing in your code and what the API does. That's a great place to start, and will give you clues about how to refactor it to make it more useful. But again, the idea is don't be afraid to change things, but that's a choice that you'll have to make. Now, some advice, and this is my own advice, my own biases, so take it for what it is. Favor concrete implementations. Don't be afraid to repeat yourself when you're going at this the first time. That's why code is cheap. Refactoring is cheap. Don't be afraid to do it. Be concrete up front, and then figure out how you can refactor, how you can abstract, how you can make things more generic. Doing this first, being very concrete in how you do your implementation, will usually lead you to how to refactor, how to make the code better, because it'll show you, oh, there's a lot of repetition in doing these kinds of things. That's where I'm going to focus on abstracting whatever it is that's going on there. Avoid implementing protocol wrappers. Reading formal specs really does suck. I know Mikey is the only other person I'm aware of in this room who has had to deal with OData. And OData sucks. It's a horrible specification. It was written by Microsoft so they could keep selling their products in the EU, and it shows. They put as little effort as they could into it to being able to keep their government contracts. But what was it? I decided to write a wrapper for that protocol spec anyways, and we'll actually look at it as an example, kind of a cautionary tale of why you should try to avoid doing that. Rely on what other people have done. If the API you're talking to uses JSON API, use one of the existing gems that already wraps that protocol. Don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. And so this is kind of, if the API you're talking to has some kind of generic spec that it implements, go look for somebody else who has already addressed that before you decide to. It'll make your life a whole lot easier versus trying to write a wrapper for a generic specification. The first gem we want to look at, and this is where we'll get into 3 different gems that we want to look at and how they approach wrapping an API. The first one is simple Bitly. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with Bitly, the URL shortener. Really, really simple. It does 2 things in reality. It shortens URLs and it expands URLs. And simple Bitly does just that. That's all it does. There's only one other class that simple Bitly defines, and it's the URL class, which has just a couple of accessors on it. The entire thing is 81 lines of code, and it works great, and it does exactly what it needs to do and nothing else. You have an initializer, username, API key, gets stored into instance variables. You then have shorten and expand, which do exactly what you'd expect them to do. It returns a simple Bitly URL object that just has 4 attributes on it. Really, really straightforward, really, really simple. It's a great example of the way you should start a project like this. And just to kind of show it a bit, we'll actually take a look at the code. But this is the entirety of this gem as far as its functional aspects. All 81 lines of it. And it's very, very simple. Again, the initializer, the shorten, and the expand, and the only bit of generic behavior that it has is this get method and then the Bitly error method, which are both private methods that do very, very little. Just raises a standard error with a message and does a JSON parse of the net HTTP get. This is probably where every API gem you write should start. Keep it simple. Keep it really, really simple. Have a one-to-one correspondence between your methods and what's going on in the API. If you do that and you're not afraid to be repeating yourself at least a little bit at first, you'll then have much clearer paths to figure out how to move forward when you need to implement something slightly more complex. And in this case, that slightly more complex, we can see in the actual Bitly gem, which is not a lot more complex, but we can see they've started to abstract things. They've abstracted the configuration. They have some utility methods, which was basically their way of avoiding including active support. That's actually some great advice. Don't include active support in your API gem, no matter how much you think it might help you. Other developers will be pissed. That's a lot of code to download to wrap an API. It then has its generic client, URL. And the thing that makes this a bit more complex than simple Bitly is where simple Bitly only supports the version 3 API and only supports it using the URL params. The Bitly gem supports both version 2 and version 3 of the Bitly API and supports OAuth authentication against that API. And so that's where it starts to get a bit more complex. But even with that, it is not a horribly complex gem. The client, it has a lot of similar features. You got the API URL, the version that gets specified. If it's switching between version 3 and version 2 clients, it's able to figure that out. You come down here to the actual client. You again have a shorten method. And basically the only thing that's making this a lot more complex is the fact that it's figuring out if you're giving it a string or an array. And then of course it has a argument error because it's actually validating the type of argument you're giving it. And so this is where you start to see something very simple starting to get a bit more complex, but you're gaining features with that complexity. You're gaining the ability to take an array of URLs to shorten, not just a single URL. And so that's the sort of thing. Functionality should be the thing that drives the complexity of any gems that you write to wrap around APIs. Expand method is very similar. Again, just double the code because you're doing 2 different kinds of input that you might receive. But then also it adds the ability to query for info and stats, which are some additional API endpoint features that Bitly provides, allowing you to look at how many times a particular Bitly URL has been clicked through, and gives you some more details there. And so again, the complexity of this gem, simply rises because it's adding more features. It's actually becoming more functional, and that's the sort of thing that should drive complexity, is actual functionality. And then of course they're choosing, instead of raising a standard error with a message, instead they're actually wrapping things up in a Bitly error, which is just a standard error with some additional capabilities. And so this is the sort of thing that after you've done your first pass as at an API, then start figuring out how you want to drive things forward. What other functionality do you need? How can you make your gem easier to work with for developers and expand on the capabilities that are already there? And then the last one that I'll show you is my gem. And again, like I said, this is a cautionary tale. This is the top level OData.rb file for the gem, and it includes a lot of stuff. Originally was going to use active support, but then I realized the only thing I cared about was active support concern. That's like 12 lines of code. There's no reason to import all of active support for 12 lines of code. So I didn't. I just wrote what I needed in the context of my gem. And in fact, I just am very verbose in the way I define the modules. But I do have a few other things that I'm dealing with because OData, is best consumed as XML. I need an XML parser. Nokogiri did this quite nicely until I ran into the metadata file that OData returns, which in the case of the dynamic CRM instance I was working with was 6.5 megabytes. That's a horrible size for an XML document to then get parsed into Ruby. Whenever this thing parses the metadata, from that file, it pretty much balloons whatever process it's in to a couple of gigabytes. Because there's just no way to represent XML as a huge nested set of objects efficiently. It's just horrible. And so one of the things that's actually happening in this gem right now is trying to figure out a way to lazily load the metadata that is needed at particular times, or to simply not represent the metadata as a giant Nokogiri document, because it is really, really not performant. But then also, because of my need to support NTLM, I'm also choosing to use Typheus instead of using NetHTTP or something else, because with Typheus, I can rely on libcurl through curb. And so I have more options here, but then I also have a lot of complexity just owing to the fact that this is a protocol specification that I'm wrapping around, and this is a generic solution. It just gets really complex really, really fast. And I've shared this a bit with Nate. He's heard me bitch about this gem and OData multiple times. But backing up, just as an example of why you should not do this sort of thing if you can avoid it. OData supports a whole bunch of base types, ints, decimals, floats, all this kind of stuff. Even supports GWIDs. But because it's XML, when it comes back to you, it's all strings. So you've got to typecast this shit. And that's horrible. Especially with GWIDs, all of this stuff has to get typecast in weird ways. Like for GWIDs, you have to preface it with GWID, single quote, whatever the GWID is, and then another single quote. That's dumb. But it has to be done, otherwise you will not be able to talk to the service. The same thing happens when you're talking about floats and decimals. They have to be appended with an M or an F for no reason. Because apparently the code on the other end can't figure out, oh, this is a decimal, because the field you're trying to write this value to is a decimal. Doesn't care. And the other thing that makes OData horrible as a specification is that service providers can extend it with their own custom types. Now they have the option of using complex types, which are actually really easy to handle because it's just a wrapper around a few base types. But a custom type actually allows them to define something that will require a typecasting object like this. And the one example that I like to use is that Microsoft Dynamics CRM has a money type. And you would think, oh, they have a money type. It's going to have a decimal and it's going to have a currency. Nope, it's just a decimal. They just wrapped the decimal type in a money wrapper and provide no additional information and just make it so that in order to make this thing talk to Dynamics CRM, you have to write a custom property that can actually extract that data. And so those are the kind of reasons why you should avoid writing specification wrappers or anything that wraps a protocol, because you will have these little weird edge cases. JSON API is really nice, but it has edge cases. It has weird stuff in it. OData is just 10 times worse, probably more than that. But it can be a lot of fun to write. And this gem was actually a lot of fun to write, except for, what was it, when I get pull requests from people that, well, not pull requests, when I get issue reports from people that don't give me any code. That really annoys me. Mm-hmm. I really like people who would contribute rather than just asking me to fix something that they're working on. And so again, I recommend looking at this gem as a cautionary tale of why you should not wrap protocols. But also, if you ever are dealing with a really complex API, don't be surprised if your project grows really, really big, really, really fast. So that's kind of the end of it. Love to take any questions, get any feedback, any experience also from folks who have also done this kind of work in the past. All right, so all of you are going to go home tonight, pick an API, and write a gem to wrap it, and it's going to be perfect.
With your OData gem, did you ever try the OGA XML parsing gem?
No.
It's supposed to be a little bit more efficient or work repetitive,
yeah,
a little bit larger.
Yeah, I've what was it? Whenever I started working on this particular project, what was it? I wasn't sure whether or not that Olga was going to be a great solution. Yeah. And so I went with what I was familiar with Nokogiri. But yeah, if I were going to revisit it, I would probably, what was it, consider Olga more seriously. Although because of the size of the metadata file that I was working with in practice, I don't know there's any way to represent that as a collection of objects efficiently. It's just too massive.
OData doesn't require the use of XML.
No, it does not, except that, what was it, the JSON specification, like it can use either XML or JSON. Yeah. And the XML is much more complete in terms of being able to give you hints about the data that's coming across and what the structure of that data is. The problem with the JSON, and this was specific to my particular use case, was that because I was using Microsoft products that implemented the JSON API, they implemented only what the spec said they had to, which was not a lot. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the JSON API side of things, doesn't expose the metadata the same way that the XML side does. The XML metadata is complete. It's exhaustive. Everything you could possibly want to know about the service is exposed that way. Yeah, Microsoft, just like, what was it, Java, they love XML. They just love it.
I'm surprised they even went as far as like writing this. They already have soap.
Yeah.
And honestly, like you said you hated this, but I was looking over the spec while you were talking about it. And I do think I would like it more than soap.
Oh yeah, it's a hell of a lot better than soap.
Okay.
Soap is terrifying.
Yeah, I've only had to do it
I mean,
like
because
twice.
it's extensible in in so many weird ways.
Yeah, all the wrong ways.
Yeah, and then of course in the Ruby community, I mean, what's our option for working with soap? I mean,
Really just
yeah.
just use Typhodia to just not
Yeah, I mean, you just have to parse the message envelopes yourself, which yeah, I don't want to do that.
Soap 4R from like
Yeah, and let it auto generate 30,000 lines of code from the WSDL. Yeah, that's also an awesome approach. Yeah.
Okay.
So a couple of questions I had. When you are writing tests for this kind of a gem, do you have any best practices as far as, do you try to write an integration test that actually hits the API? Do you never do that? Do you sometimes do that?
I would recommend sometimes doing that. In the case of like OData, the one nice thing about this, the fact that it is actually a public spec, is that they actually do provide a reference service that you can hit. But even with that, I recommend using something like VCR to record those responses so that you're not constantly hitting an actual service. But then also there's plenty of opportunity to just do, kind of basic unit testing type work. But yes, I would actually, if there is an API that you can hit, especially a test API, by all means, actually exercise your gem by writing integration tests that actually make it do something real. But you probably, and again, in this case with mine, I'm trying to remember, I believe it's been so long since I've actually worked on this silly project, that in the CI, I actually have it go through, and that's when I have it hit an actual service. Whenever I'm coding locally, it just uses the VCR cassettes unless I, know that I need to, recapture them. But when it goes to CI, it actually hits the public service that's out there on odata.org. Anything else?
Can you run through just also really quick? I'm curious to get your opinion on. You mentioned you could use Typhoeus, you could use just NetHTTP. What are the main decision points that you have for like when you choose one over the other?
Yeah, if there's an implementation of what you need in the Ruby standard library, by all means use that if you absolutely can. That makes your gem a lot easier to distribute. Means there's less dependencies getting drug along with it. So unless you have a good reason not to use NetHTTP, I would just use NetHTTP because it's part of standard lib. Same thing with any other features you might need. If you can get it out of standard lib, by all means do it. For me, like I chose Typhoeus in this case because of my need to be able to use curb and libcurl and the NTLM authentication stuff. That was a weird technical requirement that in most cases, hopefully you won't have to deal with that. And so choice of like HTTP libraries, it's really whatever you prefer. But I would tend to recommend avoiding bringing in another gem just because you like it. At least if you're planning to distribute this broadly. There are some good reasons to use different HTTP libraries from time to time. The XML parsing or parsing of different kinds of file or different formats you might have, that's a place where choosing a gem is more obvious. And that's really a matter of dealing with what are your technical requirements, what are your technical preferences even, and making the choice that you think makes the most sense. Yeah. I just tend to be an advocate of not having a bunch of gyms that you have to bring along with you if you can avoid it. All right. Yeehaw. I'll answer any other questions if anybody has them. Otherwise, that's it.
All right. Someone hit the lights. Thanks again to